The structure of internal control across the Russian Federation has long relied on centralized enforcement networks, regional compliance mechanisms, and a calibrated balance of coercion and administrative inertia. This configuration, stabilized through multiple waves of internal suppression and legislative expansion, faced sudden systemic degradation following the announcement of a new mobilization cycle. Regional centers across Siberia, the Urals, and southern districts registered immediate declines in compliance metrics. Civil registries failed to meet collection targets, and military commissariats reported record levels of absenteeism. Entire cities in Irkutsk, Samara, and Bashkortostan experienced a collapse of routine enlistment infrastructure within the initial 24-hour window. Civilian transport hubs, particularly rail junctions in Ekaterinburg, Novosibirsk, and Rostov, recorded population surges inconsistent with seasonal travel patterns. The nationwide mobilization directive, structured to activate dormant manpower pools through revised call-up protocols, instead produced a wave of decentralized resistance. Initial non-compliance reports escalated to direct obstruction. Families congregated at enlistment centers, impeding operations through continuous physical presence. Military units stationed within proximity of urban centers reported rising incidents of insubordination and personnel absconding from temporary holding quarters. Communications intercepts indicated coordinated refusals originating from multiple operational zones, with frontline personnel transmitting unauthorized declarations of withdrawal. Local administrations, in an attempt to restore functional order, reallocated civilian police units to support military registries. These efforts met escalating resistance, forcing retraction of personnel due to the scale and persistence of civilian obstruction. In rural regions of Tatarstan and Dagestan, entire communities collectively denied entry to military inspection teams, citing constitutional violations and demanding cessation of recruitment activity. Simultaneously, urban centers across the western administrative arc experienced an uptick in nocturnal gatherings. These unregistered assemblies displayed a shift in composition compared to previous protest cycles. Family units, former conscripts, and regional civic employees were present in large numbers. In Moscow, isolated flash gatherings were observed in the vicinity of major transit nodes, disrupting transport continuity and prompting emergency response redirection. The speed and geographic breadth of the disobedience exceeded forecasts issued by internal security directorates. Within the first escalation cycle, national command structures initiated partial media isolation protocols and triggered algorithmic suppression across state-linked digital platforms. Despite this, distributed media units continued to capture and transmit visual evidence of enlistment center shutdowns, deserted barracks, and spontaneous acts of civilian defiance. The failure of compliance at scale signaled a deviation from established patterns of controlled resistance. The mobilization framework, long regarded as a tool of force projection, had inverted into a vector of internal destabilization. The refusal was not localized, reactive, or ideological, it was logistical, mechanical, and population-wide. It no longer required articulation, its manifestation was infrastructural, embedded in silence, absence, and obstruction. The machinery of conscription stood still, not from sabotage, but from abandonment. The structural failure of the Russian mobilization initiative unfolded through a layered breakdown of interconnected logistical, administrative, and disciplinary mechanisms. At the district level, military commissariats experienced an immediate overload as pre-registered lists failed to materialize into physical presence. Offices across Krasnodar, Perm, and Kemerovo recorded under 10% turnout within the first operating cycle, rendering conscription flowcharts inoperative. Regional databases, designed to synchronize automated call-up signals with municipal transport and staging schedules, displayed total divergence between planned and actual movement. Trains requisitioned for personnel relocation remained idle as conscript intake points reported empty platforms and locked civilian housing sectors. Field units assigned to receive and process new conscript waves were forced to reassign internal manpower to clerical and logistical fallback roles. In multiple military districts, platoon-grade officers documented widespread refusals among existing contract personnel to participate in registration or orientation of incoming draftees. At garrison facilities near Nizhny Novgorod and Chelyabinsk, previously inducted conscripts collectively vacated housing quarters during nighttime cycles, abandoning issued gear and disconnecting communications relays. Command elements reported entire barak sectors rendered uninhabitable not due to external sabotage but from the disappearance of assigned personnel. Military police formations activated to maintain discipline within these units failed to assert control. In several cases, recorded interactions show enforcement officers choosing not to engage fleeing servicemen. In Kaluga and Ulan-Ude, mobile checkpoints installed to intercept internal desertions were dismantled within hours by local residents obstructing access routes. Logistics units attempting to recover material left at vacated checkpoints encountered improvised roadblocks erected by civilians refusing to allow reclamation of military property. Internal communications across district commands confirmed the spread of a phenomenon previously undocumented in modern Russian military history: horizontal mutiny without declared cause. The refusals were neither formalized through petitions nor escalated through active rebellion. They occurred as synchronized cessation of participation. Command structures issued orders that were not executed, and absence was left unaddressed due to the scale of its replication. Field unit cohesion eroded not from ideological divergence but from structural void. Officers faced with empty mustering fields and non-functional transport grids were compelled to suspend operations and request additional personnel, only to find no reserves forthcoming. The failure to reinforce ongoing rotations along active zones of engagement created cascading gaps in frontline stability. Internal memoranda between command segments and administrative centers referenced escalating tension within forward-deployed battalion groups. Reports from units stationed along the eastern axis indicated a loss of operational redundancy. Medical, engineering, and technical units flagged an absence of qualified replacements, compelling multi-role assignments to undertrained personnel. These adjustments further reduced morale and elevated rates of equipment failure due to improper handling and maintenance. At the institutional level, academy-trained officers seconded to regional headquarters submitted collective deferment requests or abstained from station entry, forcing headquarters to initiate internal audits into attendance anomalies. Documents recovered from declassified local registries recorded that over 100 regional mid-tier officers submitted medical or legal deferral statements within a 72-hour window. Civilian hospitals reported abnormal influx of healthy male patients requesting long-term documentation of non-deployable conditions. Forensic review of administrative databases showed thousands of sudden changes in residence registration entries, with many conscripts officially transferring to remote or non-existent addresses to circumvent summons delivery. In Dagestan, Buryatia, and Tuva, high mobilization pressure zones previously used for concentrated call-ups, community-level resistance transitioned from passive delay to active rejection. Council buildings in several districts were sealed off by groups of local residents, preventing military officials from distributing documents. In the North Caucasus, religious and civic institutions published joint declarations calling for a halt to the mobilization process, framing it as incompatible with regional stability. These declarations were not disseminated through mass media but circulated through encrypted messaging applications and printed leaflets distributed manually across villages and markets. Collectively, these developments rendered the mobilization directive unsustainable within the first operational phase. Attempts to initiate administrative substitution, whereby non-compliant districts were compensated through increased quotas in other regions, resulted in further breakdowns. Quotas issued to Arkhangelsk, Smolensk, and Tomsk were rejected by local authorities, citing lack of procedural capacity and risk of civil unrest. The mobilization network, built on vertical command enforcement, fractured under horizontal population-level disengagement. No centralized suppression initiative could counteract the absence of movement, of presence, and of cooperation. The conscription machine remained intact in form but collapsed in function. As mobilization mechanisms disintegrated, the civilian landscape across the Russian Federation entered a state of sustained public defiance. The first concentrations of protest activity emerged spontaneously in mid-sized industrial towns where social cohesion had been traditionally reinforced by proximity to state enterprises and garrison installations. In these environments, families of reservists and contract soldiers converged around regional enlistment centers, blocking access to administrative entrances and occupying nearby transport corridors. Within hours, similar patterns manifested across distinct geographies, from Tula to Vladivostok, from Kazan to Novokuznetsk, each following identical dynamics of non-violent obstruction combined with collective visibility. The absence of centralized coordination suggested a phenomenon of parallel emergence rather than organized resistance. Police formations initially deployed to clear civilian gatherings refrained from escalation due to personnel shortages and lack of clear directives. Communications intercepts from internal security networks indicated hesitation among middle-ranking officers, many of whom faced conflicting orders from civilian administrations and defense subdepartments. The internal ministry's response grid, structured to isolate protest flashpoints, became saturated as simultaneous incidents outnumbered available deployment capacity. Riot control units in Moscow, Ekaterinburg, and Krasnodar were redeployed repeatedly across districts within the same 24-hour cycle, producing fatigue and coordination loss. Reports from St. Petersburg described instances of police patrols refusing reassignment after prolonged deployment periods, citing exhaustion and inadequate logistical support. By the third escalation phase, the protest dynamic evolved from localized obstruction to sustained urban paralysis. Train stations became focal points of civilian congregation, transforming into informal zones of assembly where citizens attempted to leave mobilization districts or support others in doing so. Ticketing systems collapsed as servers overloaded from mass digital requests. Station concourses filled with individuals carrying minimal luggage, accompanied by family members who remained outside to delay police access. Regional transport ministries issued blanket travel restrictions in an attempt to slow civilian movement, but enforcement remained superficial due to administrative overload. Digital networks amplified the unrest. Social platforms, despite state-imposed throttling, circulated continuous footage of deserted barracks, closed recruitment offices, and police units withdrawing from confrontation zones. The resulting information loop intensified replication of unrest patterns across time zones. Each recorded act of refusal became an operational template for replication elsewhere. State communication organs attempted to counter the spread through narrative saturation, releasing pre-recorded broadcasts emphasizing stability and legality. These broadcasts were rapidly undermined by citizen-generated content showing empty mobilization centers and crowds reciting slogans demanding demobilization. In the Far Eastern administrative districts, where population density is lower but local autonomy higher, regional officials began suspending mobilization activity under pretext of security review. District commissariats in Khabarovsk and Sakha closed indefinitely, citing data synchronization issues. Behind these statements lay a coordinated refusal by regional bureaucracies to enforce federal directives perceived as destabilizing. This silent administrative sabotage extended upward through institutional layers, eroding command integrity from within. Meanwhile, military installations closer to the western frontiers encountered the direct manifestation of the internal breakdown. Communications officers stationed along the secondary logistical corridors reported intermittent transmissions from conscripts declaring their intent to withdraw from active deployment. These transmissions, recorded and circulated across internal military frequencies, demonstrated a new phenomenon: organized refusal originating within active combat formations. Command staff responded by disabling outgoing communications to prevent replication of the message pattern, but recordings had already reached sympathetic audiences through encrypted civilian channels. By the end of the initial protest cycle, several urban centers effectively lost centralized law enforcement control. Local administrations continued to function only in ceremonial capacity, issuing procedural statements without capacity to implement them. Public employees began abstaining from attendance at government offices, citing personal safety concerns. In multiple regions, public transport systems halted due to lack of operating staff. Markets, schools, and hospitals remained open but operated autonomously, outside administrative supervision. The rhythm of governance, dependent on command compliance, decelerated into standstill. The collapse of mobilization, which began as an administrative malfunction, evolved into a civilian phenomenon encompassing logistical, psychological, and informational dimensions. No individual leader or organization directed it; it propagated as a systemic reaction to exhaustion, risk saturation, and societal disillusionment. The governing structure faced a paradox: its coercive apparatus remained intact in theory but inert in execution. Orders issued from Moscow reached regional command nodes, but the absence of willing executors rendered them ceremonial. The mechanism of control, once absolute, was reduced to transmission without reception, signal without effect, authority without obedience. Facing the simultaneous erosion of administrative authority, collapse of field-level compliance, and unprecedented mass disengagement, the federal executive apparatus initiated emergency containment procedures designed to isolate the informational and organizational spread of defiance. The first operational vector consisted of an accelerated restriction of digital communications platforms. Within 48, full-spectrum throttling was implemented against the most widely used mobile messaging services and social media applications across national internet service providers. Regional access to major content delivery networks was rerouted through centralized inspection filters, which were configured to identify and suppress visual and textual identifiers linked to mobilization refusal. However, despite technical implementation of suppression protocols, the rate of citizen-generated media production exceeded state filtering capacity. Archival footage of unstaffed enlistment offices, spontaneous street blockades, and soldiers discarding personal equipment circulated in compressed format through peer-to-peer encrypted chains. National broadcasting organs were placed under direct oversight of the Ministry of Digital Development, which began issuing pre-formatted segments depicting symbolic support for the mobilization framework. These media packages, composed of edited interviews, stock footage, and rehearsed affirmations, failed to displace real-time content proliferating through underground information networks. The resulting dissonance between official narrative and observed reality triggered widespread rejection of state media validity, particularly among conscription-age demographics and their immediate families. Parallel to the Information Containment Initiative, internal security services activated targeted clearance operations within the civil and military administrative strata. Administrative personnel across regional departments who had either suspended mobilization processing or failed to report compliance metrics were summoned to federal audit commissions. In Tyumen, Saratov, and Omsk, regional heads of enlistment commissions were removed from office under formal charges of dereliction. Simultaneously, internal memos circulated within the Ministry of Defense authorizing preemptive reassignment of officers suspected of tolerance toward conscript resistance. These reassignments, while procedurally framed as routine, functioned as purge vectors aimed at reasserting vertical control. Special Communications Directorates deployed algorithmic monitoring tools to flag deviation in message traffic among garrison commands. Officers whose internal correspondence included phrases related to cancellation, postponement, or withdrawal were marked for immediate review. Resulting actions included forced resignations, disciplinary confinement, and relocation to remote administrative assignments. In military units still functioning near operational capacity, ideological control officers were embedded directly into chain-of-command structures to oversee internal loyalty assessments. These units, drawn from military political institutions, lacked tactical command authority but retained override powers in disciplinary cases. In the civilian domain, investigative organs initiated legal proceedings against select individuals identified as protest facilitators. Regional prosecutors issued charges under national security statutes linked to unauthorized gatherings and obstruction of military processes. These legal actions, however, were unevenly applied. In over 30 administrative regions, judicial branches either deferred hearings indefinitely or dismissed charges due to procedural inconsistencies. Court officers interviewed under anonymity confirmed increasing reluctance among judiciary personnel to participate in politically motivated prosecutions amid growing public hostility. The federal government attempted to reframe the unrest as localized and externally provoked. Official statements released by presidential spokespersons characterized the breakdown as the result of foreign disinformation campaigns and minor administrative lapses. However, these assertions remained unsubstantiated within public information space. Absence of visible corrective outcomes, combined with the expansion of protest activity, rendered narrative control ineffective. The communication vacuum at the national level, marked by absence of televised addresses and contradictory ministerial statements, intensified perceptions of a regime in reactive paralysis. Within the defense hierarchy, operational secrecy regarding troop movements and conscription metrics was expanded. Internal directives prohibited publication of enlistment figures, desertion counts, and unit readiness statuses. However, military personnel across support roles continued to leak statistics through anonymized civilian platforms. Confirmed logs from transportation units indicated under 5% fulfillment of relocation orders during the second mobilization week. Field hospital reports recorded empty intake schedules despite pre-assigned casualty rotation plans. Ammunition distribution hubs flagged and used inventory surpluses inconsistent with prior quarterly consumption metrics. Censorship protocols reached academic, religious, and cultural institutions. University rectors were instructed to deliver statements affirming student commitment to state directives. Seminaries and public unions were compelled to issue pre-approved declarations disavowing protest actions. In multiple instances, targeted institutions refused to participate. Some suspended operations entirely, citing security concerns. The resulting fragmentation of institutional compliance eroded the regime's traditional auxiliary control matrix. What emerged in this phase was not merely public resistance, but systemic reluctance across societal layers to uphold enforcement structures. The coercive apparatus began cannibalizing its own foundation, auditing, surveilling, and removing segments previously relied upon to execute policy. The state's response, driven by reflexive enforcement, further destabilized its internal coherence. In seeking to suppress the manifestation of collapse, it amplified the structural conditions accelerating it. As internal trust within the Russian command hierarchy deteriorated and public disobedience entered a sustained phase, operational coherence across the armed forces collapsed beyond repair. Mobilization echelons intended to replenish frontline sectors failed to arrive at any designated staging points within expected operational windows. Units previously functioning under regular conditions in Rostov, Voronezh, and Belgorod Oblast ceased executing rotation schedules. Field reports from border districts recorded a sharp decline in personnel presence at permanent deployment zones without evidence of organized withdrawal or reassignment. Mid-level commanders, unable to enforce mobilization procedures or sustain internal discipline, began submitting formal resignations from command responsibilities, citing the technical impossibility of mission execution. In forward-positioned units operating under heightened readiness, reports of open refusal to comply with direct orders increased and were formally documented in daily situation briefs. Platoons and companies stationed along secondary engagement sectors severed contact with headquarters, disabling communication relays and declining to acknowledge transmission requests. Analysis of encrypted communication channels revealed a substantial drop in data volume across all major operational categories, including logistics, supply, evacuation, and engineering coordination. On the southern axis, where engineer battalions and assault units had previously maintained partial combat functionality, episodes of position abandonment emerged. Entire detachments were observed exiting fortified zones after initiating controlled demolition of key structures and equipment. Some units transmitted the coordinates of their own fortifications on unencrypted channels before initiating their destruction, not as acts of sabotage, but as symbolic gestures of disengagement. These actions represented a categorical refusal to continue operational participation and a severing of contract-based obligations. Concurrently, intra-unit tension escalated into physical confrontation. At temporary storage depots in Kursk and Bryansk regions, clashes occurred between contract servicemen and officers attempting to compel participation in logistics operations. Incident reports submitted to the main Directorate of Personnel included documented threats of violence against command staff and destruction of local administrative infrastructure. Multiple cases of equipment tampering and vehicle disabling were recorded, making redeployment efforts infeasible. In some cases, armored personnel carriers were immobilized by intentional sabotage of power systems and drivetrain components. Attempts to reassert control through the deployment of disciplinary detachments proved ineffective. In Kaliningrad and Tver oblasts, convoy teams dispatched to stabilize rear logistics units were met with non-compliance and forced to retreat due to lack of local support infrastructure. Command orders from central authority, when transmitted, were increasingly delayed, ignored, or reinterpreted by field units based on perceived operational legitimacy. Chain of command structures fractured as junior officers adopted passive resistance strategies, acknowledging directives without execution, logging falsified compliance reports, or allowing scheduled maneuvers to lapse without engagement. The political wing of the military establishment initiated rapid reviews of leadership appointments, initiating emergency transfers of generals and colonels deemed incapable of restoring cohesion. However, the reassignments failed to produce measurable improvements in unit behavior. In many cases, newly appointed officers arrived at their designated commands only to find empty barracks, non-functional communications, and depots stripped of essential equipment. Some commanders refused to assume post, citing inadequate operational capacity and unwillingness to accept responsibility for disintegrating structures. On the information warfare front, previously silent field units began transmitting direct messages to civilian audiences via encrypted channels. These messages, compiled and disseminated across internal networks, consisted of declarations of refusal, logistical status updates, and appeals for demobilization. The content was structured, consistent, and widespread, indicating a level of inter-unit awareness despite geographic separation. These communications were not framed in ideological terms but emphasized exhaustion, systemic failure, and rejection of further sacrifice in an operation perceived as directionless. This phase marked a decisive rupture in the armed structure of the state. Military formations no longer functioned as centralized assets deployable under executive order. They had devolved into fragmented, locally governed bodies acting upon internal consensus or disengaging entirely. No functional reserve remained capable of offsetting the collapse. The coercive capacity of the state, long anchored in the assumption of obedience within the military, had dissolved not in combat but in stillness, refusal, and silence. As command disintegration deepened and the state's coercive infrastructure continued to erode, the security architecture within the Russian Federation entered a state of functional paralysis. No longer capable of enforcing mobilization directives or restoring centralized military order, the government initiated fallback measures rooted in symbolic enforcement rather than material capacity. Emergency decrees were issued authorizing expanded jurisdiction to military tribunals, and mobile security detachments were rerouted to critical urban centers with the intent to reassert state visibility. However, these formations arrived in regions already undergoing de facto realignment of authority. Recruitment centers remained shuttered. Military installations stood vacant. Administrative offices functioned in name only. Across multiple oblasts, impromptu civilian defense networks emerged, not to oppose the central government in active rebellion, but to prevent the re-establishment of mobilization by blocking transport routes, monitoring local roads, and denying entry to external agents. In Samara, Irkutsk, and Pskov, citizen-organized checkpoints appeared around major railway hubs. These groups operated without overt political affiliation or coordination but adopted identical procedural behaviors: inspection of vehicles, verification of travel documentation, and obstruction of military transport. Local law enforcement in many of these regions refrained from intervening. In several instances, municipal police officers were documented providing logistical support to blockade organizers, including fuel, traffic diversion, and on-site communication equipment. Attempts to reinforce military discipline via deployment of National Guard units encountered increasing resistance. In the city of Tula, multiple platoons tasked with securing key infrastructure sites defected after arrival, joining local administrative staff in formal declarations of operational refusal. Official documents revealed that several high-ranking Interior Ministry officers filed simultaneous retirement requests citing conflict of duties with internal regulations and constitutional mandates. These resignations were not isolated acts but formed the basis for operational paralysis within the security services. Without mid-tier enforcement, central directives could not propagate beyond documentation. The intelligence services, long tasked with maintaining internal cohesion through surveillance and intimidation, shifted posture from external monitoring to internal survival. Reports from closed sessions of the National Security Council described a redirection of surveillance resources away from civilian activity and toward senior military and political leadership. Paranoia within the executive complex grew as reports of unauthorized troop withdrawals, document leaks, and mass defiance increased in volume and precision. In a matter of days, the primary concern of the security apparatus shifted from protest management to prevention of internal coup structures. Within the armed forces, the concept of command authority underwent complete transformation. In regions where order was still partially intact, local commanders initiated direct negotiations with municipal authorities, seeking guarantees of non-interference in exchange for cessation of mobilization activity. In Khabarovsk and Volgograd, such arrangements were documented in the form of signed statements recorded by local assemblies and disseminated through encrypted channels. These agreements stipulated non-aggression clauses, protection of civilian facilities, and the abandonment of further conscription initiatives within respective jurisdictions. While formally illegal under national law, they operated with de facto legitimacy due to the absence of functional federal enforcement. In the information domain, the state's ability to shape narrative reality disintegrated entirely. Even tightly controlled television channels experienced mass resignations of editorial staff. Several major state-affiliated outlets were forced off air due to absence of technical personnel. Content streams from within protest zones and abandoned garrisons continued uninterrupted through decentralized nodes, creating a real-time ledger of collapse accessible to both domestic and foreign audiences. Every image of empty barracks, every video of blocked rail lines, and every message from soldiers refusing orders contributed to a cumulative erosion of legitimacy that no single broadcast could counterbalance. Administrative continuity across civil infrastructure degraded into selective functionality. Postal networks, judicial systems, and healthcare services remained operational in many regions but did so under self-directed control without oversight from federal ministries. Taxes were no longer collected in several rural districts. Civil registries ceased reporting mobilization-age demographics. The state continued to issue orders, but their transmission failed to intersect with any receiver capable or willing to enforce them. The final stage of the mobilization collapse was not marked by a declaration or single incident but by the normalization of refusal as a governing logic. Resistance was no longer episodic or exceptional, it became procedural. Institutions no longer debated the validity of federal directives, they simply ceased to respond. The structure of power, hollowed out by absence, remained standing in appearance but functioned only as a memory of authority. Within weeks, vast sectors of the Russian Federation had transitioned into autonomous zones of passive non-compliance, not governed by opposition but by rejection. The war had returned to the interior, and the cost was no longer counted in foreign theaters but in the unraveling of domestic control. The comprehensive failure of Russia's mobilization infrastructure and the cascading dissolution of military cohesion marked a threshold beyond which federal authority could no longer reconstitute itself through traditional mechanisms. The events did not unfold as a revolution, a coup, or an armed uprising. Rather, they constituted a full-spectrum systemic breakdown in which the foundational premise of state command, the ability to compel obedience, was voided simultaneously across multiple layers of the military, civil, and administrative apparatus. Strategic analysts across European and Eurasian defense monitoring agencies characterized the phenomenon as a hybrid collapse, an event precipitated by excessive political extraction from overstressed populations and institutions without the support of viable feedback or adaptation systems. The immediate tactical consequence was the deceleration and eventual paralysis of Russian operations along all active military fronts. With replenishment routes severed, rotation schedules suspended, and rear-area support structures inoperable, the capacity to sustain forward deployment shrank to minimal levels. Reports from multiple active sectors confirmed static front lines, loss of tactical initiative, and a sharp increase in voluntary withdrawal from contested zones. These operational contractions occurred without formal retreat orders, reflecting a shift in battlefield psychology from strategic engagement to systemic disengagement. In several cases, frontline units negotiated informal demilitarized corridors with opposing forces, exchanging safe passage for the abandonment of positions and material. Domestically, the collapse produced an unprecedented inversion of state-society relations. Regional governors, long conditioned to function as transmitters of vertical authority, were now acting as mediators between federal expectations and local refusals. Their primary objective shifted from implementing central orders to preserving localized stability through selective noncompliance. Across over 20 regions, unofficial agreements between local governments and community structures enabled the restoration of limited services, conditional on the full cessation of enlistment activity. This inversion institutionalized resistance not as an opposition project, but as an administrative norm. The federal response apparatus, built for the management of isolated dissent, proved structurally unfit for the demands of nationwide procedural disengagement. Attempts to apply coercive models generated diminishing returns as enforcement personnel withdrew participation, logistical support evaporated, and the symbolic weight of the regime's commands eroded in real time. Security organs transitioned from deterrence to containment, focusing on preventing the spread of leadership fragmentation rather than suppressing civilian defiance. Within this vacuum, informal governance structures emerged, some based on local councils, others on self-organized civil protection networks, which began to manage essential services, transportation, and information flow independently of central coordination. The Kremlin's strategic communication posture collapsed under the weight of internal contradictions. Official statements denying unrest clashed with thousands of verified images, videos, and first-hand accounts circulating through global media ecosystems. The international community interpreted the silence not as ambiguity but as incapacity. Sanctions regimes previously calibrated around foreign policy actions were now reframed to reflect internal instability. Foreign governments revised diplomatic protocols, reassessing the reliability of Russian institutions to uphold obligations, both bilaterally and multilaterally. Embassies reduced staff, consular services were suspended in several major cities, and foreign investment channels initiated emergency withdrawal procedures. Symbolically, the failure of mobilization shattered the narrative of strategic depth long projected by the Russian state. The image of a population ready to absorb indefinite sacrifices in pursuit of long-term geopolitical goals was replaced by empirical evidence of mass disengagement, silent refusal, and administrative entropy. The absence of protest slogans, political demands, or revolutionary leadership emphasized that the threat to regime continuity did not originate from ideological opposition but from the disappearance of compliance. The structure of the state was not attacked, it was left alone. In military theory, strategic defeat is often defined not by the loss of territory or forces, but by the inability to project power or regenerate capacity. By that metric, the collapse of Russia's mobilization effort constituted a full-spectrum strategic failure. It not only disabled the replenishment cycle of the armed forces, but also triggered the implosion of domestic credibility, the severing of vertical control channels, and the fragmentation of political coherence. The war, initially externalized as a distant campaign, had returned inward. But unlike previous cycles of crisis, it encountered a population no longer willing to absorb its cost, not through protest, but through absence. What remained was not resistance in the traditional sense, but vacancy. A hollow state structure, operational in form but void in function. Orders were still issued, uniforms still worn, buildings still lit, but the machinery no longer moved. The collapse did not arrive as an explosion, but as silence. The system, deprived of consent, simply ceased to operate.